Good morning or afternoon or evening, everybody. On behalf of the Gender and Trade Coalition and the Consortium on Gender Security and Human Rights, I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar on trade, gender, and post-war recovery, exploring the intersections. My name is Carol Cohn, and I'm the director of the consortium, which is based at the University of Massachusetts in Boston. In the last few months, it has been our great pleasure and privilege to collaborate with the Gender and Trade Coalition in co-organizing this two-part webinar series, which explores the relationships between gender, trade, and the prospects for building sustainable peace. For the consortium, this set of relationships is an important part of our Feminist Roadmap for Sustainable Peace and Planet project. The Feminist Roadmap project is based on the premise that building peace that is politically and environmentally sustainable requires addressing the inequalities, marginalizations, and exclusions that underlie armed conflicts. And it focuses on the transnational political economic actors and dynamics, and also closely related to those, the transnational climate disruption and environmental degradation processes that tend to deepen inequalities in countries emerging from armed conflict instead of transforming them. Our goal is both to analyze and to work to transform those processes through developing innovative feminist solutions. In our work on this project, we have come to see international trade architectures and practices as a major force shaping and often undermining the prospects for sustainable peace. Yet its impacts and import are too often unexamined or overlooked by communities that work on post-war recovery, on peace building, or on the women, peace, and security agenda. In our own learning journeys on this topic, we've learned a tremendous amount from members of the Gender and Trade Coalition. So it has really been a gift to be able to now collaborate with the GTC in organizing these webinars, which aim to analyze and bring more attention to the intersections of trade, gender, and post-war recovery. So now I'd like to turn to Anita Nayar, Director of Regions Refocus, to tell you more about the Gender and Trade Coalition and this webinar series. Anita?
Thank you. Thank you so much, Carol. As a co-chair of the Gender and Trade Coalition, I'm really delighted to collaborate with the consortium on this two-part webinar series and really to introduce the coalition to a new audience that's joining us today. A brief background to share with you all: the Gender and Trade Coalition was initiated in 2018, essentially to put forward a feminist trade analysis and advocate for equitable trade policy. So we actively shape a trade justice agenda by increasing consciousness, by engaging in research, by engaging in advocacy for policy alternatives. And we stand in very clear opposition to the co-optation of women's rights as a tool for further liberalization of capital, of resources, and of labor, which we're increasingly seen being done by major institutions like the World Trade Organization and the International Monetary Fund and so on. So we're standing in direct sort of opposition to this kind of co-optation. The coalition has grown to over 300 members over the last few years, which really reflects a cross-section of civil society groups, from feminist groups to academia, trade unions, and development organizations. And we hope that many of you all will be interested in joining the coalition as well, which really involves signing on to our unity statement, which is on our website. And so when the consortium reached out to collaborate, members of the coalition were really excited to explore what we see as a relatively new intersection of trade and, quote, post-war recovery. And in planning these two webinars, we had, very robust conversations about how we as members of the coalition would define the concept of, quote, post-war, given our realities of living in contexts of continuum of conflicts and wars. Looking at the issue of trade, which is often posited as an important element of post-war recovery and reconstruction and development, but in fact, looking at how trade, in fact, is a tool of conflict and threatens sustainable peace. So there's a lot that we were discussing internally, and so we see this first webinar as an exploration, and which is why the title is such, as an exploration of these issues, and looking at the intersections from a feminist perspective. And the second part of the webinar series, which is a week from today, really addresses what we see as potential alternatives to the current construct and the current paradigm. So while we'll discuss alternatives today, the emphasis of alternatives will really be next week. And this week is more sort of exploring the intersections and the concepts. So I hope that gives you a sense of what we've been doing over the past few years. We've engaged, as I shared, in different policy spaces, whether that's the WTO, the Commission on the Status of Women, the UN Conference on Trade and Development, as well as particular trade agreements such as the post-Cotonou agreement, the EU-Mercosur agreement, and RCEP in Asia Pacific. So there's different ways in which you all could engage with us, and we look forward to a continuing collaboration with the consortium. But without further ado, let me pass on to the chair for today's session, which is Michelle Masiziwa, and she will introduce our speakers and take over the conversation for the rest of the webinar. Thank you again to everyone for joining. Michelle?
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today. So today in our discussion, we're dealing with a very important topic, a timeless topic, if I may. I just want to take you through a bit of the framing of how we're going to go through the discussion today, as well as briefly introduce our speakers. The first thing perhaps important to note is we'd like to invite you, as the presentations are being made, to kindly make your comments in the Q&A section. And then once the presenters have made their presentations, we'll be able to take your questions and then be able to get responses from the speakers. Thereafter, we'll also have we'll have several opportunities for questions and answers. Okay. So again, our topic is on arguments and intersections of trade, gender, and post-war recovery. The discussion takes off from the premise that international trade is often perceived as an important and useful tool for post-war recovery, for reconstruction and development, and it can facilitate cooperation. However, trade is also commonly accepted as creating both winners and losers, which suggests that sustainable recovery and reconstruction may not necessarily be automatic outcomes of trade. Therefore, in this two-part webinar series, we want to examine the kind of trading paradigms that are currently being pursued in post-war contexts and the relationships they have with sustainable peace. We delve into the connections between trade, gender, climate justice, and digital justice, noting that the intersections of gender, trade, and post-war recovery remain a relatively unexplored area. In terms of the content that we're going to cover, the webinar first provides an introduction to gender and trade, and then secondly, an introduction to gender, peace and security, and human rights, and thirdly, it explores the intersections. On our panel today, we have Lebohang, just a moment. We have Lebohang Peko. She is a senior research fellow at the Trade Collective, a feminist-centered think tank. She's also an activist scholar, international movement builder, and decolonial African feminist. She is a Lancet Commissioner in Reparations, a founding fellow of the African Futures Lab, and a long-standing part of several feminist formations, including the Women in Migration Network. We also have on our panel Fatima Kelleher, who is a member of NAWI AfriFem Macroeconomics Collective. Fatima is a Pan-African feminist, Nigerian and Irish-British independent women's rights strategic and technical advisor involved in feminist policy, research, and advocacy in areas of economic justice, education, and health. And then we also have on our panel Dr. Azra Talat Saeed of Asia Pacific Forum on Women, Law, and Development. Azra is an executive director of Roots for Equity, an organization working for the rights of small and landless farmers. That includes the rights of women farmers and agricultural farmers, and she's part of the anti-neoliberal globalization movement and has fought against the WTO and neoliberal policies fighting for farmers' rights. So today's session is only the first of two webinars. It's part of a 2-webinar series that we're hosting, the next, which is going to take place on the 27th. In order to give this discussion a bit of context, I'm just going to walk through a few of the basic principles of international trade, and then thereafter I'm going to hand over to Lebohang to start off the discussion. Okay, so just to set some context, international trade, because that is part of the key themes of today's discussion, it is the exchange of goods and services across borders. The current trading system is largely based on a free market approach, which enables the market to regulate itself by removing state-imposed barriers such as taxes and various restrictions on business. And neoliberalism has been sold as some kind of a silver bullet for developing world's economic problems, yet the benefits have been slow to come. Moreover, the neoliberal agenda has permitted a huge shift in power from national governments to corporations and to non-democratic bodies, such as those responsible for regulating global trade. In many ways, this has undermined the fulfillment of human rights. So, for example, Greenspan and Kreklovich note that trade transfers significant powers to non-elected and unaccountable bodies and institutions and gives the highest guarantees of expression to the rights and freedoms of transnational capital. And while neoliberalism has its benefits in some ways, in recent years, it has become glaringly clear that international trade has numerous and diverse environmental, health, and social impacts, and evidence is showing that women tend to bear the brunt of these adverse effects and are disproportionately affected by them compared to men. It has now more than ever become important to look at trade not only from a mainstream economic perspective, but also from a human rights perspective and a women's social justice perspective. And now, having provided this background, let's bring in some views from the panel. I'd like to invite Lebohang to please provide some kind of conceptual framing for today's topic, looking at the masculine constructions of war and state, the fluidity of war, peace, and feminist intersectional theory of war. Over to you, Lebohang.
Thank you so much, Michelle, and to the co-panelists, and thanks also to all the organizers of this event. So basically, I'd like to really take us through the idea of the state firstly, because I think it's almost impossible to speak about the idea of what war and peace are, what security and unsecurity are, and what non-peace and non-war look like without the locus of all of these events and all of these happenings and these situations, which is the state. And for a long time, I suppose I've been watching some of the and following a lot of really solid radical feminist writing, which speaks about the state as in the context of militarization of human relations, in the context of political science, economics, and the law, and this idea that gives rise to the changing nature of the state. And the state is really embedded behind other ideas I'd like to suggest of globalized spaces, of capitalist spaces, of masculinity and expansion of hypermasculinity, toxic masculinities, lack of social provision, and enforcement of boundaries and borders as well. And I think that the whole idea that the state is a gendered representation of power seems to bear itself out, especially in its discourses on violence, on development, and on neoliberalism. And in some of my previous work, I've spoken about how I don't really think states like women very much in the first instance. And I think, speaking particularly from the positionality of a decolonial African feminist, I would like to suggest that states inherently, even though they're supposedly independent and free, and in some respects free from the jurisdictional power of colonial forces, in divesting themselves of that colonial power, the sacrifice of that was women. And I think for many of us who grew up in a particular generation were aware of the notion of, seek the political kingdom first and everything comes after that. So the economy, gendered relations, feminist power, feminist revolutionary power and thinking. And I've always been of the mind that what this means is that in fact, women are just adjacent to the project of the state. And frankly, I think this is why there's so much combativeness, aggression, hostility, and toxic violences towards us, which is manifest in different ways in policymaking, in budget spends, in the way that our citizenship and our personhood is framed, in the way that violences on multiple layers are actually are playing themselves out in society, and how some of these violences are normalized. So states are fond of talking about the war on terror. Of late, it's been the war on COVID, the war on poverty, but actually using deeply violent, militaristic language when we're in fact trying to frame social developmental, socio-economic development imperatives, things that should be about nurturing, that should be about social solidarity, are instead framed as though this is framed as though this is some kind of a standoff. People are wearing fatigues and we're going to war. I mean, I remember, even, for example, the president of South Africa coming on screen at the beginning of the COVID pandemic, giving one of these family meetings, as we call them here, wearing army fatigues as though he was going to a war. And I think that this is the kind of ways, these are some of the ways in which things that militarization and violent militarization are made normal by states, even in times that should actually be peaceful. So I think that what feminism has, also feminist economics and our own analysis, helps us to do in framing states, in framing war, and in framing peace, is then to the extent to which the degrees of security, the concepts of security, have actually been constrained by very masculine, male-centered blinkers, and they don't take account fully of the kinds of security issues that women confront daily that are associated with structural oppressions, structural conditions of non-peace, and actually of non-personhood to a great extent, which in relation to men, for example, domestic violence, for example, climate change, and for example, the many employment fragility, living in poverty, living in precarity, and the many things that are just the antithesis of living in peace. And of course, many of these things are actually the reasons and give rise to how wars come about in the first place. Access to employment, access to resources, access to land, for example, and how many times a lot of the skirmishes that occur, particularly in relation to external powers, are to do with the very interests, the asset base that many women domestically find it difficult to have access to. And so what happens is that they also failed a lot of our conventional thinking around war, peace, and security doesn't take into account the specific ways which women are affected by war, by military occupation, by militarization, by forced migration, by human trafficking, sexual and other forms of slavery, and forced sexual labor. So then I think in saying that, that it's also useful to then think around the role of men and masculinities that has resulted in the role of how we relate to war, how we relate to peace, and how we relate to power, whether or not states are at war in the guns and bombs sense, or whether they're in a place of non-peace. So I think that also brings me then to the notions of the definitions and the fluidities of war, peace, and some kind of intersectional theory of what war actually may or may not be. So I find it a helpful frame because it helps us to deal with the gendered nature of armed conflict, especially in respect of the construction of conflict-related identities. So there's an argument that goes that gender as an intersectional concept encompasses masculinity, and it also plays an important role in helping us understand the root causes of conflict and the multiple ways, as I've mentioned, that conflict can come about. So one of the most important parts of institutional responses to underlying structural inequalities that often embed wars and embed conflict and insecurity are revealed in this intersectional analysis. And this could include legal frameworks, economic frameworks, indices of social and economic inequality, indices of poverty, indices of mortality, indices of public safety, indices of social and development infrastructure, which are often then exacerbated and lost and extenuated during times of conflict. So I think that the aim of all economic reforms, often proposed by guiding actors in post-conflict situations is really what essentially a war economy. And by that, the structures of economic relations that prolong or actually sustain violence. Peace economies, on the other hand, are arguably constituted by the economic relationships that neither benefit from or have a causal relationship with physical or organized political violence, corporate violence, economic violences, and the conflation of these oftentimes. So many scholars have classified peace economies as neither negative nor positive, but rather the idea that that physical violence is a result of economic incentives. And at the root of many wars are economic neoliberal imperatives. And I'll say a bit more around that as well in the context of so-called rebuilding and the neoliberal constructions of what rebuilding sometimes looks like. But when we think about the feminist understandings of peace, it's the idea of a peace that is co-creative and that it eradicates multiple sources of oppression based on social identities, ethnicities, race, caste, and so forth. Looking at, for example, the post-war, post-conflict situation in many countries, such as Egypt, such as Afghanistan, such as South Africa, which I'll say a bit more about shortly, one can see that many times what has often happened is that the collateral damage of so-called peace agreements is the absence of peace and the usurpation of women's economic citizenship, social citizenship, and political citizenship as well. Now, war is often a neoliberal, misogynistic undertaking that reproduces, and its reconstruction is again often a reproduction of these very causes. So trade in post-war reconstruction can often result in reinscripting and reproducing existing state and economic problematics. So the liberal worldview is founded on two interlinked premises. The one is the inherent capacity of markets to deliver prosperity and development globally, whatever development may or may not mean, sometimes a politically problematic term, and secondly, the increased prospects for peace in the context of state integration along neoliberal institutional and market lines. Now, decades of neoliberal integration and market orthodoxy, whilst they might have brought nation states closer together, as patriarchal and as sometimes toxic as those states may be, they have also engendered degrees and forms of interstate inequality and within world market capitalism and populations across the world, which then prey into greater forms of violence of markets and growing interstate inequalities and growing interpeople inequalities as well. So in this context, the contemporary rise of nationalism and populisms across the world is not just some illiberal antithesis emerging from a vacuum, but rather a logical consequence of the violent, economically violent, socially violent order, constituting an often reactionary counter movement that can't just be tackled with prescriptions for forced market globalization. So our focus on the everyday forms of violence that neoliberalism's rescaling of violence and risk from the international stage down to the individual has actually resulted in the contemporary rise of much more toxic politics, much more fundamentalist politics in different dimensions. So to quote Galton, who says that violence is present when human beings are being influenced so that their actual somatic and mental realizations are below their potential realization. So in other words, when we're not in the space where we can be everything that we are designed and have the potential to be. And there's a distinction made there between direct violence, which is the instigation or an act of violence that can be traced to a person. And of course, the one that many of us experience much more easily and much more pervasively is the structural, the systemic violence, where the violence is so built into the structures that it keeps on manifesting itself as unequal life opportunities, unequal life chances, and it keeps on manifesting itself oftentimes as situations where war is almost inevitable because of the fragility of those societies. And yet at the base of this, oftentimes there are of course masculinized capitalist interests that are at play to foment and to keep the idea that that peace is never going to be possible, like the DRC, for example, like South Africa to some extent, like Libya, like Iraq, and so on and so forth. And even though peace is broadly understood as freedom from violence, whether this is the absence whether this is the absence of structural violence in the form of social injustice and oppression, is still still an important area of great debate. So one case study, of course, and one really problematic issue around constructs of war and the fluidity between war and peace is the neoliberal economic policies that often pervade in post-conflict societies. So, for example, the kind of economic reforms that are initiated by IFIs and by donors, Sierra Leone being one example, which hugely oversimplified the relationship between poverty and conflict, and suggested that all that needed to happen was that growth and peace would emerge as a result of trickle-down theory, our favorite thing. And even though Sierra Leone may have enjoyed a reasonable period of growth after the conflict, although it was a jobless growth, it was also a growth that was beset by an increase in poverty and some other indices as a result. It did not trickle down to the most indigent, to the non-waged. It didn't trickle down certainly to the most dispossessed and the most marginalized, which is often the case. And it certainly didn't trickle down to, for example, former combatants as well. So issues such as food security, unemployment, and poverty continue to be pervasive problems in many parts of Sierra Leone, as in many so-called post-war or post-conflict societies. Hence, I think the notion of war and peace being on the same spectrum becomes even more compelling, a compelling space of investigation and exploration. And even though FDI is deemed to be essential for the development of post-conflict countries, contributing to the creation of new employment opportunities and bringing in new technologies, it is useful to note that, of course, many of the potential negative consequences of FDIs in post-conflict countries, including the aggravation of conflict over access to land, as I mentioned previously, or access to jobs, or revenues generated by companies, is extremely problematic and extremely toxic.
Sorry to interrupt you there. Thank you so much. This is so engaging. Unfortunately, we do have to move on. We're going to come back to you because we have several questions, including that case study that you mentioned. But you've mentioned how the role of men and specifically masculinity, and how it has framed how we think of the state and how we then interpret war in that context and where women fit into that context. So thank you so much for actually simplifying some very complex terms and making them easily understandable for the rest of us. And now I'd like to invite Fatima. Fatima, we know that the World Trade Organization and various regional bodies have started introducing gender in a lot of their discourses. So the question that I'd like you to invite you to answer is, could you provide an overview introduction of gender and trade? We know it's becoming more and more important, so maybe understanding what it is and what the connections are could help. And also specifically, what is the connection between free trade and the use of bilateral aid?
Thank you so much, Michelle, and thank you so much, Lebahang, also for starting us off with that, as already said, unbelievably engaging analysis, and I hope to do some justice to the conversation by following through with that. As was mentioned earlier, this is a new exploration for many of us, so please bear with me as I also try and form some of my thoughts around these alignments. But to respond to you, Michelle, yes, the first thing I'd like to do actually is perhaps take us to that space which I felt myself also needing to go to immediately, of unpacking what the relationship is between gender and trade. And what I will do is actually present a feminist positioning on this. And I think the first thing to do really is to understand that trade and trade liberalization, in particular free trade, unfettered, market-driven trade, the orthodoxy that now dominates our understanding of trade, or what is put forward to us as the only way to trade, has unequal impacts. And simply because the economic shifts that occur following liberalization have significant impacts across the population, and particularly on the lives of those who are the most oppressed within society. The economy is already an unequal structure, and this follows multiple intersectional lines of oppression, whether you're talking about gender, class, race, sexuality, and beyond. Now, what that means is that overall, women and men are also impacted differently by trade liberalization. And that would be at the macro, the micro, the meso levels. And, so what we're talking about, for example, is if a sector expands or contracts on the back of a trade deal, where women are placed within that sector will lead to some sort of disproportionate experience. And again, at the household level, increases, decreases in impact in income, and the subsequent power relationships that flow with that will also have differentiated impacts on women. Now, women's participation in the economy itself takes multiple forms: workers, producers, traders, consumers, users of public services, taxpayers. The way that the WTO and more mainstream organizations who have recently started looking at gender and trade, the area they focus on tends to be in the space of women as producers and traders. And this is very much following quite an instrumentalist version of women's economic empowerment theory that really atomizes women's lived experiences of economic engagement. And so what you would find is that even where workers, women as workers might take some form of a discussion, you'd rarely be talking about workers' rights, for example. And so there is this sense of focusing on women as producers, primarily as entrepreneurs, micro-entrepreneurs, accessing them into the market in some way, and then allowing them to become empowered miraculously, just as the market itself miraculously answers all questions over a period of time. The long term, as is often referred to, although the long term is never given a definitive amount of time, interestingly enough. Having said that, we understand, and the free trade theory says this itself, that there will always be winners and losers on the back of trade liberalization. It acknowledges this. The theory, nonetheless, is that there will be an adjustment that takes place over a period of time. And by the time we get to, this long term, this undefined long term, some adjustments would have taken place. And so, for example, if you have, as a country, you have a dairy sector that is negatively impacted because you are now unable to compete with another country that has a far bigger and more efficient dairy sector, you will find something else in 10, 15 or more years that you will then become comparatively competitive in. Given that the long term is never fully defined, it's interesting that the numbers of people in the generations whose lives and general happiness will be sacrificed as collateral damage to that adjustment are rarely discussed. So that's just a way that we look at gender and trade, and the way in which we understand the importance of going beyond just this micro-focused entrepreneurial approach, because we also know that women are users of public services, and trade agreements, although they never explicitly talk about privatization, for example, we do know that it is often implicit within there. And so you have, for example, the movement of private sector companies coming in on the back of trade liberalization processes, and women's public services are particularly of importance to women. And I will never refer to women as consumers of public services, but only ever as users of public services, because that distinction is absolutely critical. And here we're talking about health, education, energy, water, care services, street lighting, roads, bridges, even more efficient, well-trained legal and policing services for their needs. And once that gets reduced down to a commodity, women then become consumers of these services and therefore become part of and become at the mercy of the vagaries of the market and the way the market then determines the affordability of those services. Another aspect of the way in which we look at gender and trade from a feminist positioning, and this is perhaps where we certainly differentiate from the more mainstream version of gender and trade that has been picked up more recently by mainstream organizations, is in relation to the unequal power relationships in terms of domestic policy space between the global north and the global south. So many of the protectionist policies that were available to the global north as they were developing themselves are today completely unavailable to governments in the global south. And these can be further undermined by global trade rules. So this leads to constraints over national policies, which means that there isn't that level playing field that free trade claims there is for all parties to be able to benefit. And this then exacerbates the significant power imbalances between the global north and the global south. And what that means is that countries are unable to deliver the support at the fiscal level in terms of wage protections, in terms of workers' rights protections, the industrial policy that they often need, which women are desperately in need of if their rights are actually to be supported on the back of trade deals. So you have a locking in of liberalization and a dismantling of restrictions over capital flows. And all of this in time can lead and often leads to increased economic vulnerability. And you have other trade rules and obligations that can further diminish sovereign control over those policies. So this then takes me to the role that aid plays in post-conflict context. And I will get to a more specific case study of Nigeria, but what I first want to do after giving that background is just talk a little bit about the way in which bilateral aid is increasingly seen as a facilitator of the market and of market development. An interesting paradox, given that the market is technically supposed to fend for itself. One example of this are what are known as market systems programs, and I'm not sure how familiar people are with those, so I'll give a bit of a background. They were more commonly known as markets for the poor, and their aim was to promote market linkages. And I'll just pull out a little section here from the Department for International Development going back to 2005 that changes the structure, in inverted commas here, and characteristics of markets to increase participation by the poor in terms that are of benefit to them. It addresses the behavior of the private sector and therefore reinforces the strengths of market systems rather than undermining these systems. Now, I've spent some time looking at market systems programs, and one of the things that has struck me is that this successful market linkage that's being discussed here is based primarily on the successful sale of goods and services and a sustained increase in demand and supply from consumers. So there is an expectation here of expenditure. So the participants or beneficiaries, as they were unashamedly called 10 to 15 years ago, poor or otherwise, need to spend money in order to engage with the market. And therefore what you have is a very clear exploitation and corruption of the term market access in this case. And those programs over time have also come to now look at gender as something that's important. And so you have a gender agenda that forms within them, and women's economic empowerment is brought into them. And primarily it's about reaching women in terms of numbers. These programs have very huge numbers in terms of their end game targets. And within the economic empowerment definition, often income increase is the primary indicator. And this is seen almost as an automatic empowerment. No discussion around control often follows. And if it does, it's often quite simplified. And so what you see here is a gradual focus on women as consumers within the market, as opposed to any kind of equal empowerment between market actors. So indeed, you could argue, even for those of us who shy away from using women's economic empowerment, that it is indeed a corruption of women's economic empowerment in itself. Now, these market systems programs have been operating in Nigeria for some time. And in the Northeast, a few years back, there was a move to look at how market systems programs could move into what was then viewed as an area that was moving out of conflict. And the fluidity around that is a whole another discussion, and I will touch on it briefly, but I think Lebahang has sort of framed the challenge around that already quite well. So what we're going to do now is I'll just speak very briefly for the last 5 minutes on Northeast Nigeria, and try and give a bit of a lens on how market recovery was viewed in that region, and it was attempted or is being attempted in that region, and how market systems programs are a part of that. So just a quick context background. The conflict in Northeast Nigeria has been going on for over a decade now. Extreme experiences of violence, community displacement, loss of livelihoods, food insecurity, a decimation of public and private institutions, and general economic collapse. Two states in particular were no-go areas for the international community until 2017. And around that time, from 2018 onwards in particular, there was, however, as incidents of the violence had decreased, there was a view to move towards, or to move from, humanitarian aid towards some kind of market recovery. Interestingly, despite the conflict, the Northeast had been identified as one of the fastest growing markets in Nigeria, and companies were very keen to tap into this, including Unilever and Coca-Cola, and adopted, significant activities. One interesting facet of how some of that was playing out: traders have been traveling to state capitals, often with a military escort, to buy products at the wholesale market to distribute to more dangerous parts of the state. And this became a unique economy of private security contractors, which emerged from this, and indeed, to a certain extent, is dependent on a level of insecurity for their continued existence. So this already indicates that when we talk about market recovery within that context, it is also being framed, although not explicitly so, as an opportunity for market entry for indigenous, yes, actors, but also for international actors, including some of those I have already mentioned. And international trade and trade liberalization more specifically, therefore, plays a critical role whenever we talk about market recovery as part of a post-conflict recovery process. Now, women within the region, prior to the conflict and during the conflict, were earning their incomes primarily through home-based income generation and some smallholder farming. The conflict decimated much of this and increased their precarity, given that they were already within what were horizontal enterprises. Women's primary liquid assets, small ruminants, were the first to go as food insecurity increased. The breakdown of security and displacement meant that women's organizing, including economic organizing and traditional savings groups, were gone. Women's smaller farm plots did actually, or were more likely to survive, and to a certain extent, because they were not as dependent on agroeconomic inputs as on agro-industrial inputs as men. But then what you find is, as the markets come in, they are focusing quite heavily on women as consumers of many of these products. So we're talking about agro inputs, we're talking about credit, we're talking about time-saving devices, all of which to try and meet these targets. And so you have, within this credit economy and this increased precarity, a move towards making women more dependent consumers of a volatile market. And so there are several areas of concern here. And I see I've just been given a time check, so I'll try and wrap up with these areas of concern. Firstly, it is the fragility of women's home-based income generation and the way in which, by being viewed as producers and consumers, and only producers and consumers, and the push towards increased women's expenditure as consumers, and of market products, all of these I've already mentioned, you have an embedding of that precarity within the post-conflict context. Now, the other aspect is aid-driven market programs often have a high percentage of non-indigenous extracontinental actors, with big corporations using them as a foothold to penetrate economies. So conflict-affected contexts are therefore viewed as being in need of market recovery, and are therefore a target that provide a decimated slate for those powerful actors to enter. Another concern is that these actors include, for example, those agro input companies via their subsidiaries in Nigeria and beyond. Africa as a whole has one of the lowest level of agro-industrial inputs in the world and is therefore viewed as a rife market. And the push for a green revolution in Africa, despite some of the very clear critiques of an all-encompassing agro-industrial paradigm and the negative impacts it has, is a very, very powerful one. Alternative approaches are rarely looked at. Trade and trade liberalizations provide one of the motors of all of this to occur in the first place. Although privatization, as I said, is not explicitly stated, it is implicit within that. And this creates an entry point for private interests in the rebuilding of services and moving the focus away from women as users of public services. And there is the fact that this reality is supported by the conditionalities that Lebahang has already mentioned that come from IFIs, such as the International Monetary Fund, where austerity policies are expected of countries taking loans in order to rebuild their economies on the back of any crisis. Nigeria has experienced this for decades, as have many of our countries on the continent, with critical public services being cut and the role of the state in the provision of what are effectively universal rights to their citizens being curtailed in ways that you do not find in the global north itself. And those same austerity policies also place greater tax burdens on those with the least. For example, the IMF has recently advised Nigeria to increase its VAT rate to 15% by 2026, a levy that will fall more heavily on women. And as women become locked into this identity of being consumers within a market-driven vision of what trade should look like, this leaves them in ever greater levels of precarity as they become more dependent on the market itself. And I will stop there, otherwise I think I've already blown my time, I can see, but I'll stop there and take any questions that come from that. And thank you for allowing me to explore this even in my own head with you today.
Great, thank you so much, Fatima. I do apologize for the background noise. Thanks so much for your presentation. You've clearly illustrated the various roles that women play in trade and in society, and as well as the implications of trade for domestic policy space. And I think what also comes out quite strongly are the contestations against the perception of women as merely consumers. So thank you so much for your presentation. I'd like to move on now to Azra. Dr. Azra Talat Said. So, excuse me, just a quick question for you perhaps. One of the things that has been on many people's minds lately is the conflict in Ukraine. And we've heard in the media that there are now shortages of wheat and oil in the global markets. But I do understand this is an ongoing conflict, so it falls outside of the scope of our discussion today. But could you perhaps speak to the war on terror and provide any kind of illustrative examples on how this intersects with food aid and the juncture with women and children? So we're looking at conflict, food, and how that how and where women and children fit into that discussion. If you may, Azra, over to you.
Thank you so much, Michelle. Thank you. I would really, I have a presentation, so I'll try and start that. And I'll try and keep within the time. I hope so. Okay, so I will, as you just said, Michelle, I will really talk about food fortification, which as I think of it as it's an extremely favorite weapon of imperialist countries for increasing trade capacities in our regions. And I will look at Pakistan and Afghanistan, especially Afghanistan in the context of the horrific war that was happening there for the past 20 years, and with the shameful exit of the United States, leaving the country in a very, very dire strait. And I will give you an example of how it really had an impact on the lives of the people. And as was pointed out by Fatima just now, as women, as primary consumers, we tend to make them not only consumers, but also as victims of war. And so we see that more and more when these countries which are very fond of going into other people's territories, conquering and staying, and then leaving behind immense destruction, are then using women constantly as if they are the most humane of all, in terms of, now I can't get my screen to move. Okay, great. As if the women are, their human rights, the human rights of the warring countries, they are so bent on looking after women and children first, and ensuring this aura of peacekeeping, of being there for eternal peace, whereas actually they bring nothing but eternal war on our communities, on our nations, on our regions. So I very quickly, to just give you a sense of, Pakistan has had refugees since 1978, 79. We've had one of the biggest refugees in the world ever. And right now we are the third biggest country in holding refugees from Afghanistan. And I will not really just go through the numbers. They're on the screen. I hope people can see it. But it's more than 2 million right now that people from Afghanistan are living in Pakistan. And for the Afghan population, the situation is extremely dire inside their own country and also in Pakistan. We all know, as you just mentioned, that Ukraine and Russia are at war, and we all know that 20% of wheat production comes from Russia and Ukraine. And Pakistan is mostly self-sufficient in wheat, but a lot of the wheat that Pakistan produces is then smuggled into Afghanistan, which creates extreme shortages in Pakistan as well. And we have immense hunger and malnutrition on both sides of the border between Pakistan and Afghanistan. According to some figures, Pakistan has 44% children who are stunted. This is the third highest percentage in the world. So we are talking about nearly 10 million Pakistani children who are suffering from chronic deprivation, from uterus and to early childhood cycle, which also talks about the anemic, malnutritious condition of the women who bear these children. And so then if we go to Afghanistan, their stunting is almost as close to Pakistan, it's 41%. And so we are talking about two regions where malnourishment is very, very high. And right now in Afghanistan, we all know there are sanctions from the United States. And so actually no aid or very little aid is trickling into Afghanistan. And there is extreme high levels of hunger in that area right now. Just wanted to show you some of the military aid which has flown into Pakistan from the US. And in the years 2009 to 2014, which is what I would really like to focus on, we can see that economic aid and military aid was at a very high, all to fight the so-called war on terror. And this so-called war on terror, we know very well, actually was also created by the US in the context of creating madrasas in the 1970s to fight the Soviet Union at that time. In any case, during the 2011 to 2016 period in Pakistan, the government of US was providing a lot of food assistance. And what we found, we were doing a study on trying to figure out how aid is used in war. And we, to my shock, I found that the United States is actually giving money. The Americans never give money. We all know that they really like to just give food in kind, so to subsidize their own farmers and their own corporations in the country. So we researched this further and found out that actually the money was being given for food fortification. And I'll go into that in a minute. But right now, I'll just focus on the kind of money that was coming into Pakistan. And so they were giving money for, they call it twining of wheat, which is milling and fortification of wheat with micronutrients. Micronutrients are basically vitamin A, vitamin E, vitamin D, and other very small fractions of nutrients and minerals, which can cause immense malnourishment amongst the populations. So it was not only the United States, but also many countries in Europe, and also the United Kingdom, we found a note saying the World Food Program is extremely grateful to the UK aid agency for generously and timely donations of 4.85 million US dollars, a bulk of which was used for twining. So you can see that this was a kind of a coherent strand in the aid which was being given to Pakistan and Afghanistan. On further research, we found some key policy initiatives which the US specifically had been taking in both the countries. The US aid-funded Afghanistan and Central Asian Regional Food Fortification Program ran from 2014 to 16, and its aim was really all about improving wheat and edible oil fortification processes, and they were trying to strengthen regulations, I repeat, to address incorporating micronutrient products into the food that was being grown and produced in our own territories. And so there was not only the question of fortification, they were also bringing in something called premix, which is that the food fortification processes are always done abroad in the European countries, in the US, in the rich industrial countries. And then they just bring in what they call the premix and add it to our food products. And so the whole context of food fortification key policy initiative was to ensure that the process was regulated, there were standards that were created, and there was harmonization. You know, harmonization is a very key word that you need to look for in international trade. And that is because when you have harmonization, it's easier for corporations to trade from one country to the other. They don't have to keep on changing their standards according to the country specifics. So they create international trade harmonization patterns that is done through the World Trade Organization, which Fatima has talked about as well. And interestingly, the whole food fortification program was being implemented by the Global Alliance of Improved Nutrition. I mean, that is such a hypocrisy. What is GAIN? It is basically a consortium of very big multinational corporations, and they have been advocating market-based strategies for alleviating hunger and malnutrition. And I will go into this also a bit later on, but GAIN is basically run by the likes of Unilever, Hershey's, Mars, others. I have the names of others. Nestle, of course, Nestle and other big corporations that we have. These things there. Okay. Now, so what did they do? They immediately changed the food fortification policy. In Pakistan, there was no national legislation on wheat flour fortification, and they got hold of Punjab, which is our biggest province. 53% of the population of Pakistan lives in this province, and it is responsible for 70% of wheat production. They created an authority called the Punjab Food Authority, and let me tell you that the Punjab Food Authority was also a prerequisite for the implementation of the sanitary and phytosanitary sanitary and phytosanitary agreement, as well as the technical barriers to trade agreement. These agreements are the basis for the creation of an authority like Punjab Food Authority, whose basic responsibility is to regulate food quality in the province. And there are other food authorities across the country, and they're all regulating food products coming from the international market. They're also now, it's a big area, they're also now regulating the locally produced milk. Now, milk is something which is produced entirely by women in this country. Most of the livestock caregivers are women, especially in Punjab, which I've just said, 53% of the population is there. 93% of our livestock producers live in Punjab. So the whole issue of regulating milk is also very deeply embedded within this Punjab Food Authority, which has been created solely by the United States. And a lot of this money came in during the war years of 2009, 2014, when the Americans were aiding Pakistan in a very big way to so-called crush the Taliban in Afghanistan. Although they had NATO sitting in Afghanistan, I'm not sure what NATO was doing in Afghanistan in all these years. Then in 2014, the Punjab Food Authority approved a new wheat flour fortification standard, which is what they were after. And this is a table again taken from a study by Gain. And you can see, if you look at the last source, funding source for 2014 in Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, Pakistan, Afghanistan for wheat flour were just donors and industry and our governments. So you can see that the entire structure of wheat, which is the staple of all these countries, was given directly into the hands of the industry, not only wheat, but to create a system of so-called fortification, which would actually take away the entire process of wheat manufacturing. You know, like wheat comes as grains and then it has to be converted into wheat flour from small producers into very big producers. In essence, the conclusion is that food fortification and corporate interest runs on two lines. So the number one line is biofortification of crops, where they carry out genetic manipulation of seeds. I will add that Pakistan's Seed Act was amended in these years, 2016, and the Plant Breeders' Rights Act was also carried out in these years. And a lot of this had to do with institutions run by the United States, for instance, the IFPRI, which is based in the US, and it created a large volume of documents, market-based documents for the government of Pakistan, stipulating that you have to go through market reforms in the policy arena. So you can see that the big seed corporations are Syngenta, the Moro Seed Company, and these are now intermingling, associating with these biotechnology firms to create biofortification of the wheat seed. The second arena of food fortification, which is actually much more, both areas are equally dangerous, so I will not try to put a weightage on one or the other. The micronutrient deficiency or hidden hunger, which I've just told you about previously, is being addressed through food fortification and adding these micronutrient food agents such as vitamin A, D, and so on. Both biofortification and crops are highly lucrative businesses for corporate giants. The top 7 food fortification corporations are Nestle, Kellogg, Bean Foods, Kraft, General Mills, Campbell Soup Company. And of these 7, the 7 who actually control the entire therapeutic foods, as they're called, or the food fortification processes and products, 6 of them are from the United States, and only 1 is from Switzerland, which is Nestle. And we all know very well the kind of market controls that Nestle has on milk as well as on water. So now you can see from this slide the kind of profits that the market research arena of the corporate sector has done. They are expecting that the market will go up from $363 million to $807 million, which is a jump more than twice. And so based on this, they have carried out a truly diabolical policy change in the country. So the war, so-called war, has now shifted from Afghanistan, Pakistan to Ukraine, as you pointed out, Michelle. But in reality, what they have done is they have created a policy change. They have created institutional change in our countries. And these institutions and policies, because we are in extreme debt. Even today, we were thinking that the situation that is happening in Sri Lanka may well be in Pakistan very soon, which means that if this continues, if they keep on allowing therapeutics to come into the country, our debt burden keeps on increasing. If they allow to monopolize our milk, which is the basic nutrition of our children and of the women, of the people of this country, nutrition is going to be nowhere. We are going to see massive levels of malnutrition. And so I know that you have put a timeline on me, so I will try and stop. But I would like to just say that I don't think that the work on war and trade is new. I think this has been ongoing since the British colonialism, since the colonialism in Africa, since the colonialism in Latin America. The institutions change, their methods change, but the ravage that they bring to our communities is just unbelievable. So I would just like to say that we are now in the arena of imperialist wars, and we will see more and more ravaging of our systems, of our production systems. And it is unfortunate that they're using women to divide us. They're using the very call of women to create this sense of that patriarchy is responsible for the inhuman acts that are happening against women in our countries, as if patriarchy is as strong as bloody imperialism. So I would really like to emphasize that patriarchy is very strong, no doubt. I am a Pakistani, I live in an Islamic country, and I know all about patriarchy. But actually, the real culprit lies the corporations and the war machinery of the United States for certain, and of course, other European countries. Thank you so much.
Right. Thank you so much. As you can see, this is a very sensitive topic, and thank you so much for giving us some.
You, Fatima. I can't hear you, Michelle.
Okay, can you hear me now? Is it better? Okay, I'm hoping everyone can hear me. Otherwise, I can try to use earphones. Okay, so thanks for confirming, Carol. So once again, thank you, Azra, for your presentation and for providing us some valuable statistics which actually illustrate the impact on the food market. Thank you so much for your presentation. Now we have an opportunity. We've received a few questions in the Q&A box. And I also invite all our guests, you're welcome to add your questions in the Q&A box. And I want to thank all our panelists for your presentations thus far. We've got a few questions coming your way, and I'll just ask you if you can respond in about 2 minutes so that we can get to as many of the questions as we can. Without wasting any time, let me start with Lebohang. So the first question that has come up for you, just one moment, is that you've discussed so brilliantly the masculine framing and how that influences how women are perceived in the context of war, and that the socially violent political order is becoming more fundamentalist, creating unequal life opportunities. So the first question is whether you could provide some illustrative examples of this within the South African context.
Yeah,
and
thanks.
Then, okay, you can go ahead and then I'll ask the next question.
No, so sorry. Do you want to just maybe just
that could make it easier. Okay, so let me also ask the other panelists, and then we can hear a round of answers before we move on to the next set of questions. And then for Azra, there's a question here. Is there an alternative approach in the post-war context where food security is often a life and death situation? So let's start with those two, and then we'll continue into the next round. Let's start with you, Lebohang.
Thanks, Michelle. So thanks. I think in terms of the South African case study, and in response to your question, it's an interesting and very fluid context. So the one is that it gives us it questions and it challenges the construction of what war is and the locus of war. And I'd like to suggest that South Africa as a case study, as a war, an anti-imperial colonial war, took place for over 400 years in different places, right? From the moment of invasion to 1994 and beyond that. And I think that the problem with these sorts of constructions of war as a place where men put on green fatigues and go to some bush somewhere far away and shoot at each other and bomb each other as though there's nothing else, there's no other context, as though this happens in a vacuum, is really completely debunked by the South African scenario, where much of the war took place across urban and rural areas, across township areas. I think some of us, people who have a certain age or who have, watched old documentaries, will be well aware that in many townships and in rural areas, and also across the region, the South African war, the liberation war, was externalized and it was regionalized, so to speak, which is why many people, my family included, came to be in different parts of exile across the region. So I think that complicates the notion of the locus of war, and also complicates the notion of who is actually a combatant, because there were people who were private citizens who were actually combatants as well. I mean, for the fact that they were politically active, for the fact that they were in particular neighborhoods, for the fact that they were engaged in various forms of protest. And I think also to say that this includes people who were also living away from the war. So if I may use a personal example, that when we were growing up in Zambia, where we would see there's a whole bunch of struggle families from different countries who were in the same community: Zimbabwe, South Africa, Lesotho, Mozambique, Angola, and so forth. And I think we would see SANDF, South African National Defense Force planes flying very low, particularly over our streets, particularly over our roofs. And by 7 p.m., we needed to be in, otherwise we couldn't account for what would happen. So I think that sense of fragility and lack of peace, even though we were physically away from the geographic locus and the political locus of struggle, really illustrates that the war it's just not easy to contextualize and to center. It can happen in multiple places and spaces. And lastly, to say again in the South African context that because of the settlement, rather than a liberation victory in a really classical sense of the word, where you can say, okay, the settlers gone and African people in, because of this settlement where we're living in this very uncomfortable peace, very, very uncomfortable peace, which manifests itself in all kinds of ways, economically, socially, politically, and so forth. And it also manifests in other social dis-ease, including violence against women, including unemployment, including particular social behaviors, including mortality rates. And again, to say that our past is still with us. And in many respects, we live in a siege mentality, and the war is just not over. And I would also argue that nor is this a fully liberated state. Thanks.
Thank you, Lebohang. Let's go right on over to Azra.
Can everybody hear me?
Yes, we can hear you loud and clear.
Okay. Yes, there is actually a very easy way out. It is so easy that it's unbelievable that they don't do it. In Pakistan, 5% of households own 65% of land. And the rest of the land, which is 35%, is left for 95% of the rural families. So you can imagine the concentration of land in the hands of the very rich elite feudal lords is being maintained. And now that the land is being taken over under even the Chinese, China-Pakistan Economic Corridor and other market-based agreements that are happening, land is being given to and for infrastructure and so on and so forth. If only land distribution is done, ensuring that women are recipients of land, food security is no problem, because women will produce food crops first and foremost for their children, for their families, and it is easily doable. It's not only that they can, and land is very, very closely connected to livestock. Livestock can only be reared if you have land. Without land, you cannot rear livestock, especially in these days of marketism, where land is being privatized and all common spaces are being taken up. So people who keep livestock, even if they don't have land, they will go and lease land. And leasing land is becoming so expensive because of the foreigners. In Pakistan, 20,000 acres of land has been taken over by PepsiCo, the company which produces Pepsi Cola. 20,000 acres of land to produce potatoes. Can you imagine? For these chips, which is really bad, poor quality food. So on one hand, they are producing Pepsi, which is extremely bad for our children, for all of us. And then they are now producing potatoes. So to me, there is only one answer. We need to, I'm very sorry when everybody talks about peace. I believe there cannot be peace till there is just peace. And so in my country, we are willing to fight, and we will fight. These imperialists who come and take our land, take away our rights, take away our food, take away our very dignity. Can you see what is happening in Sri Lanka and Afghanistan? Why should we ask for peace? We need to fight them and get them out of our countries.
All right. Thank you so much for your responses, Lebohang and Azra. Again, just highlighting the multifaceted nature of war and its implications. And then another issue that has been discussed earlier, the issue of privatization and how that impacts on also the quality of food that is being produced. So can we call it reconstruction and development if we're not dealing with the actual quality? Is it enough to just produce food that's available to everyone? I guess that's a question that remains. I'd like to move on now to Fatima on this question. So this is just digging. Hopefully you'll be able to find something for me here. But I want to ask, so you've explained to us the intersections between trade and as well as food aid and gender. I'm just wondering, is there any kind of intersection or dynamic between the urban context in which that is applied compared to the rural context? So just thinking around the types of activities that happen in urban areas versus rural areas, the types of services, whether public or private and so forth. And then the next question again is, so Fatima, just hold on while I ask the next question, please. There's also a question for Azra asking what guidance can be given for US and European-based feminists who wish to be in solidarity with Pakistan, Afghanistan, and countries in Africa affected by war and imperialist trade policies. The question further says, what would you like to see us do in our countries and contexts to try to counter the harmful policies you pointed out? So I'll have to give each of you just about 2 minutes, and then we'll see if we can take one more round of questions before we wrap up the discussion. So let's start with you, Fatima.
Thank you, Michelle. Yeah, so my own knowledge of the way food aid was distributed is not the area that I have focused on. But one thing in terms of the urban and rural dynamic that did come to me as I was looking particularly at the northeast of my country and trying to understand how market systems were planning to penetrate the space, and market approaches were trying to penetrate the space in the quest for market recovery, as it was put forward, was that obviously urban contexts are more heavily dependent on internationally delivered food than rural contexts. So interestingly, and this varied, you cannot give an overarching kind of experience of this because it all depended on how a particular context was experiencing the conflict itself. So you could find a rural area whereby through its remoteness may not have had the same levels of impact from the conflict and was therefore left largely alone. And what you would find there is that actually more traditional systems of agriculture, a refusal to engage, and I say refusal here very specifically because I met farmers who said to me they did not want to engage with agro-industrial products, so the Syngentas and Monsantos of the world, Azra has already discussed, and stuck with agroecological approaches, weathered the conflict far better, were able to continue to access their own subsistence foods far more confidently than those who had already bought into the agro-industrial paradigm, because the cost of fertilizer seeds had quadrupled actually during the conflict. In terms of food aid itself, obviously the urban areas would be the first to access. Wherever the administration had a greater foothold, you would see that. But like I said, it didn't necessarily mean that you were better off for that, given that you were more dependent on external sources of food and had been more cut off from the localized sources of food that modernization is supposed to sort of remove us from, but we now find ourselves desperately more in need of in the face of crisis. I think what's very critical about what I did experience, and this ties into what Azra has already said, is the way in which these conflicts are viewed as an entry point now, and I'm re-emphasizing what I've already said here, as an entry point for external private actors, and rarely indigenous actors. If they are indigenous actors, they're often subsidiaries of external private actors. So the main profiteers will be shareholders in other countries, and how these are seen as catalysts for market entry by external actors who will come in and often disrupt what have already been quite successful forms of market engagement over years. And women will be the ones to be at the coalface of that on so many levels. And one area we haven't even discussed here is the way in which climate actually is then also, climate has been a major contributor to the conflict in the Northeast because of the disruptions it has caused to livelihoods. And yet, if we look at what's happening in terms of the Northeast being seen as an opportunity for agro-industrial companies to go in and further the green revolution, church that has been pushed in Africa as the only form of agricultural development, and the biodiversity loss and the climate loss that comes on the back of that, and we have seen come on the back of that in other parts of the world, we also see a furthering of climate crisis as a result of conflict being viewed, or post-conflict being viewed, as an entry point for big private sector corporations. And I will stop there.
Thank you very much, Fatima. Azra, if you can just very quickly, there have been a few questions in the Q&A box and also in the chat box that are speaking to engagement from other civil society organizations or just other women that want to participate.
I've kind of answered in the chat as well, but in any case, I think the war in Ukraine and Russia is of immense importance in terms of food security, because of the very fact that Ukraine is a huge breadbasket, especially for wheat, and also I believe for fertilizers, which, although it's an agrochemical input, most of our farmers across the world are dependent on these. And when you don't apply these chemical fertilizers, the production falls. And production has been very low in Pakistan in the previous year because of the heat and the locust attacks. And Africa, I don't know what that has done in Africa, but for certain, in many parts of Pakistan, it has had a very bad impact on other crops, thankfully not on wheat. I feel that you cannot anymore look at food security without looking at climate change and climate crisis. One thing I would just like to add on is this craziness in the European countries and in the United States. They're asking for 10% ethanol in their vehicles. So the 10% ethanol is being produced in our countries through sugarcane and maize. So what is food for us? Sugarcane is not food, but sugarcane is taking up land for which was being used for growing wheat. Sugarcane stands for a whole 1 year, for 3 years actually. And so that land you cannot grow wheat on. That in itself is also impacting on wheat production in many countries, not only in Pakistan, across many countries. So we need to have a very holistic and a combined resistance strategy across women groups who are there to tackle. Somebody asked in the chat, what can we do in the US and European countries? Go to your lobbyists, go to your parliamentarians, and really ask them to stop getting this bloody ethanol from other countries. They can grow their own ethanol or do whatever they want. That is there for them to decide. Don't use our land to grow ethanol or diesel for their big cars, where in my country, people don't even have a bicycle to ride, So the inequity that was already there has been just literally stretched far apart. And we dare not agree to imperialism. We dare not agree to any kind of neoliberalism, which is now on a really bad rebuttal, because the Americans are really feeling the pinch. And that is why we are seeing the war in Russia. It's not about Russia, really. It's all about the United States. We need to be very critical of the wars that are happening and go to the cause. My last word is, please don't forget Palestine. Don't forget Kashmir. And don't forget the many millions of people who are going hungry. Thank you.
Thank you so much for those inputs. I'm just looking at the clock, and I'd like to perhaps go into some closing remarks from the speakers. You've shared some very valuable insights, and I still have two remaining questions, which if you don't mind just answering together with your closing remarks. One is for Fatima, which is a question in the Q&A box speaking to, are there any organizations or collectives that are aiding the BIPOC women trying to rebuild their lives and communities after war? And also there's another question, sorry, for all the presenters, the question is, what alternatives are there? And then if you could please wrap up your presentations, I'll give you 1 minute each. And just a reminder to all our participants, once you leave the meeting room, there'll be a pop-up just to evaluate. It will take you 1 or 2 minutes to fill in that form. So if you could please evaluate, that would be really valuable for us. But before you leave, let's hear some final remarks from our speakers. We'll again start with Lebohang and then move on to Fatima and then Azra.
Thank you. Gosh, I think just to summarize again and say that I think the idea of war and peace are very complicated. And I think that to also make a call, I suppose, for global solidarity, because I do think that because our states are so toxic in many respects and are so tied up with power, patriarchal power, I don't think that we'll get to a place where there is an absence of war and substantial or just peace, as has been said, without global solidarity amongst women in particular. And I think this is really what has led us out of many difficult quagmires over the past, I think, across the African continent, African and global South feminists and liberation movements in urban and rural settings have been the ones that have continuously continued to foment and reimagine a world that looks different. And also lastly, to just say that it's also important to continuously make the links between the economic and capitalist interests, which both of my esteemed co-panelists have articulated, and the endless cycle of war as an industrial and capitalist machine that needs to keep on feeding itself. And I think that, states, governments, the people saying, what can we do? Talk to your governments, talk to your states, keep on lobbying, keep on divesting from particular products if you can, and keep on raising awareness. This is partly, certainly not entirely, but this is partly what happened in the South African scenario, as imperfectly as it may be, but global pressure does work. And I think being conscientious and conscious citizens is part of that. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Lebohang. Over to you, Fatima.
Thank you. So I'll just briefly answer the question really, and I'm not sure I have much more on that to wrap up, but the question, are there organizations or collectives who are aiding BIPOC women trying to rebuild their lives and communities after war? Absolutely, yes. In every context I have seen, there always are. And often they're the ones that you don't hear about. So you'll hear about the big international NGOs, and often those big international NGOs are doing their work through those women and those organizations. And sometimes, they will highlight and profile them, and sometimes they will not. But very often, every time, they will not capture the gamut. And we're talking about women who are running these organizations out of their living rooms, out of their trucks, out of their cars, within the conflict context, outside of the conflict context. Going back 22 years when I started the journey that has brought me, to this webinar today, I was welcomed into the arms of a woman in Khartoum who had set up an organization working with Southern Sudanese displaced women in the city, and who were widowed, had lost their husbands, their families, their sons, were often criminalized within the city because, the only source of income was producing alcohol, found themselves in prison, and since then, every context I have been in, that has been in anywhere near close to a conflict or post-conflict context, you will always find those unnamed women doing this work. And the greatest sadness is that we do not see them as often as we do see the much larger organizations. So never doubt that. Even right now with Ukraine, I'm hearing about diaspora organizations that are trying to reach out to the many African descended people that we have seen being stopped at borders, not being given the kind of refuge that other refugees have been given, as well as those in some of the receiving countries like Poland, Romania, etc., who are focusing doing on BIPOC communities in particular coming out of Ukraine. So there are many. And yes, the greatest gift would be to be able to really recognize and acknowledge the work that those women do, because many would not survive. Those organizations were often led, nearly always often led by women, many would not survive without them.
Thank you so much, Fatima, for that feedback. Let's hear from Azra, your final remarks in just 1 minute or less.
I think what is really needed to be done is to promote small producers, especially women. At the end of the day, it is food which will be needed very, very critically. I don't think there is such a thing as post-war. I was actually quite puzzled when I saw the title. I asked them, which post-war are we talking about? Because especially when I live in South Asia, there is no post-war. There is constant war. And whichever country, wherever you look, there is constant war. So to me, the biggest strength that we will have will be from us, the people. There is no looking to our governments. There's no looking to the northern governments. Even the aid agencies are very problematic, to be honest. I thought Fatima was very generous. I find many of the big organizations very problematic when they work on the ground, because they create a kind of competitive environment which destroys the solidarity of the communities. And our hope is in the women, in the men, in our children, in our youth, and the solidarity to stand up to imperialism. And that is the call that I have from myself and from the many women we work with across the region. Thank you so much.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much, Azra, and a big thank you to all of our presenters today. Thank you for setting out the context and helping us to understand this complex subject, which intersects in so many different ways, and for even laying out the background for the next webinar, which we're going to have. And I'd like to encourage all our participants to please join us next week, same time on the 27th of April. We have the topic, Visioning Feminist Trade Alternatives for Sustainable Peace. So Visioning Feminist Trade Alternatives for Sustainable Peace is going to be a continuation of this discussion. And then also a reminder, when you log out, you will see a pop-up, and we really would be grateful if you can take a minute or two just to complete that, please. So once again, thank you so very much to our presenters. Thank you to our audience that engaged in this conversation, and we look forward to engaging with you again next week. Thanks everyone, and enjoy your afternoon or your morning, depending on where in the world you are. Bye for now.